Hilltop Securities is leading the herd in municipal finance, building on a 75-year legacy of public service and trusted personal relationships. Through decades-long partnerships with local government, state agencies, and nonprofits, we've made a lasting impact on our communities. We've helped state HFAs make housing more affordable by providing mortgage hedging and pipeline management. And we've helped generations of individual and institutional investors reach their financial goals. That tradition continues as we find new ways to support our clients' changing needs.
Go ahead, Bob.
Good afternoon. Welcome to the inaugural session of Housing Washington 2023. I'm Bob Peterson, Deputy Director of the Washington State Housing Finance Commission. It's my distinct honor to welcome to you Rasheedah Phillips of Policy Link. Her topic today will be addressing race and gender inequities at the root of housing injustice. Rasheedah Phillips is an American artist, author, community activist working for Policy Link, formerly out of Philadelphia. So when she begins her presentation, I hope you will enjoy it. But most importantly, if you have questions, we will have a Q&A at the end of the presentation. You can send your questions via the chat. And with that, I'll hand it over to Rasheedah. Rasheedah?
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much. Thank you for having me. My name is Rasheedah Phillips. I will start off by just sharing that I am currently serving as Director of Housing at Policy Link. For those who aren't familiar, Policy Link is a national research and advocacy organization that serves the 100 million who are at or below the poverty line. And I direct the housing, futures, and land justice work in our portfolio is primarily focused on anti-displacement, tenant protections, movement infrastructure, and supporting the people who are facing, who have the most experiences with facing housing insecurity. And we also center racial equity in everything that we do and uplifting what works as well. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what Bob graciously talked about in the introduction. Going to talk about gender and race inequalities at the intersections, particularly in terms of the housing context. And I'll start off by talking just a little bit about myself, and just to say that in my own life, there have been pivotal moments where the stability or lack thereof of my housing had really profound implications on a course that my own life would take. And so I am living proof myself of how secure housing can be essentially a linchpin in determining someone's trajectory. So before moving, so I currently live in Los Angeles, California, but before that, I lived most of my life in Philadelphia. But even before that, I came from a place called Trenton, New Jersey. I grew up there until about the age of 12 or so. And Trenton is a very small city. It's a place with a largely African-American population that is impacted by systemic poverty, by segregation, violence, educational inequality, a lot of the things that a lot of communities around the country are experiencing, but definitely places like Philadelphia and not unlike places like Ferguson or Flint, right? And so born into a cycle of young motherhood, myself, my mom had me at the age of 14. And despite her best efforts to elevate us out of our circumstances, that cycle persisted. So I became a mother myself at the same age of 14. And so that stigma really impacted me, as a teenager, around that time, I was basically told, or the stereotypes that were enforced upon me were to abandon my education. I was told by teachers, you're not going to make it. You basically should get a job, these sorts of things, and folks that didn't believe in me. But it was with the support of my community, my mother, one guidance counselor who told me I was smart and that I should think about college. Those things helped me to graduate high school with honors and steered me towards pursuing a law degree. And so when I first entered Temple University's Beasley School of Law, at this point I was living in Philadelphia, my perspective on my career choices were really quite limited. I had not ever known another Black attorney. I had never met another Black attorney before. I really didn't have a sense of what were the possibilities. I had really been confined by the sort of experiences and media portrayals of the legal profession that I saw on TV. So my essay, to try to get into law school was about an ambition to become a prosecutor. believing that that would be the path to addressing the injustices that I had seen myself in my community and that I had also experienced firsthand in my family. But as I navigated through law school, particularly while caring for my young child, housing insecurity remained a constant challenge for me. I frequently had to move residences, often settling for substandard housing conditions simply because that's what I could afford or what I had time to pursue, being in law school, having a 5-year-old and all these other things and working at the same time. And so really was just pushed to the corners of the city in a lot of ways and frequently had to move. And one defining instance for me was moving into an apartment that didn't have heat or hot water during my first year of law school. And so I knew enough to write a letter. I knew enough to make a threatening letter, but that for me was really an experience to where I found out that there was a thing called legal services, right? And that's what I wanted to pursue after that. So after drafting that letter demanding my own rights as a tenant, also little did I know that I would later be crafting similar letters professionally as an attorney with Community Legal Services of Philadelphia. And so that organization, which specializes in providing the very supports I once needed, like fair housing advocacy, underscores the role that things like legal services and housing programs play in shaping life outcomes for people who are in similar circumstances. And so my own life circumstances may not be that different from the people that you all serve or that you all see and that you work for in your own, situations. And so just to say, right, again, my outcomes could have surely been different had I not had access to those things. And those critical junctures really set me on a particular path, helping me to avoid a different kind of path, right? Consistent access to housing, food, childcare, that enabled me to complete my education and start a career that would then enable me to continue to maintain those things, is what allows me to be here today to talk to you. And so as a queer Black woman and as a mother, I am among the most statistically likely to be facing eviction and homelessness for all the reasons that I just talked about. And odds are stacked against women like me at every turn. It's not just housing, it's the economy, it's the legal system, it's all of these things that undercut us before and after eviction, before and after we face housing instability. And every system is really designed to fail Black women at every turn. And this isn't a coincidence. This entire system is built on that outcome. And so we have to ask who profits, who benefits from this outcome, and who's most deeply impacted by these outcomes. And so for that, right, we can delve a little bit deeper into some of the realities of fair housing and structural racism in general. Black women earn, on average, just 63% of what non-Hispanic white men make as per US Census data. This income disparity manifests itself as an overwhelming economic burden. So we know that out of 4 million households that are led by Black women in this country, a staggering 1 million live below the poverty line. The National Equity Atlas, which is a project of my organization Policy Link, has data from 2019 that starkly illuminates this housing burden. So while 36% of white households find rent to be a financial strain, 58% of Black households experience a prohibitive housing cost burden as a financial strain. So in places like Maryland, places like Philadelphia, the majority of people struggling with extreme rent burdens are single mothers and people of color. And these aren't just isolated data points, right? They are part of a network of structural racism that limits access to secure housing for Black women, other women of color, and their families. And so I know you all have probably heard of the award-winning work by Matthew Desmond in his Pulitzer Prize-winning book, Evicted, Poverty and Profit in the American City, where he showed that having children in a household exacerbates the likelihood of eviction, and other research has shown since then that that is true. And in my own experience as a housing attorney, I know that to be true. And then moreover, multiple studies affirm that Black households, even when their median rents are comparable to those of other ethnicities, still end up paying more due to various systemic factors. And so that creates that further imbalance in housing burdens, which just continues to layer inequality in the lives of Black women and other women of color. And then notably, right, Black women achieve some of the highest rates of educational attainment in the United States. And so this contradicts that notion that a lack of education or individual circumstances is the root cause of housing instability. The problem often lies in systemic barriers that impede Black women's access to long-term housing and to fair legal processes. So in practice, we witness this glaring truth every day in our offices, right, in our courtrooms, in our classrooms, wherever we may be working. That eviction disproportionately impacts these families, Black women, their families, their children, right, their community across all income levels, and not just those with low incomes, right? So we know that it's a poverty problem. We know that it's tied to that as well, but it is not just a poverty problem, right? And in fact, it is a cause that relates very specifically to race and gender, because we see that it is not just people with low incomes who face these highest levels of housing instability. It's across all incomes within race and gender considerations. And then during the pandemic, right, for example, we found that 49% of eviction filings in Philadelphia occurred in predominantly Black communities, and 78% occurred in communities of color. And that means that also the areas hardest hit by COVID-19 are the same communities, right, that were facing the highest rates of eviction. And so this synchronicity, if you will, between eviction rates and COVID-19 just adds another layer to an already intricate web of systemic disadvantages that Black renters face. And then we also know that according to the Consumer Financial Bureau, housing insecurity has only deepened. It's dramatically increased actually since the onset of the pandemic, which again just further exacerbates these already deeply embedded and entrenched inequalities. And the ramifications of eviction are long lasting, right? They're not just a snapshot in time. Even though, right, they're a snapshot of someone's circumstances in time, the eviction itself leaves an indelible mark on an individual's tenancy record, right? And that imposes future housing barriers. So even if the tenant prevails in court, even if they enter amicable agreements to preserve their housing, they continue to face those housing barriers when prospective landlords misinterpret old court filings, employ these blacklisting practices with blanket denials of applicants with eviction records, right? It can be as simple as having a policy that says we don't consider people with eviction records, period. Or not even a written policy, having an unspoken policy that when you call up and you ask, right, they're going to tell you, no, we don't accept people with eviction records, right? So these are the sort of barriers that people could have one filing. You know, I've represented tenants who have an eviction filing for a $50 late fee that they missed, right? These sorts of things follow people for the rest of their lives. And even when you have rules in place, there's a federal, you know, under the Fair Credit Reporting Act, these are supposed to disappear off of your tenancy record for after 7 years. That doesn't mean that they disappear from the system, right? And so these records serve as a barrier just as bad as criminal records often for people in terms of using those records to deny people housing. And so with that, right, people are only left with few options. They end up right back in the same circumstances, substandard housing, living in neighborhoods where they're cut off from better jobs, better educational opportunities for themselves and their families. And we often will use this, you know, when we talk about these things, when we sort of try to wrap our head around these circumstances, we often describe these situations using the language of crisis or natural disaster, right? So these terms that denote sort of an urgency or unforeseeable circumstances. We heard this with the pandemic, you know, but really this language of entrenched crisis really kind of obscures the issue. So in places like Philadelphia, which was once a stronghold of home ownership until the 2008 foreclosure crisis started to shift those demographics, this language may seem apt, right? So for a long time, Philadelphia recognized, you know, we had a home ownership level that was over 60%, right? So a very high level of home ownership in the city. But once the foreclosure crisis hit, again, it shifted those demographics. And so now the city's about 50-50 in terms of that. And so in terms of how it thought about renters, it really had to expand its language and not understand renters as people who are just transient, people who, you know, if they fall behind on their rent, they're poor, so they need to move, right? So really understanding that home ownership was not the end all be all for everyone in the city. And so once this sort of came into view, again, this notion of calling it a crisis, even calling it a foreclosure crisis or an eviction crisis. It can sometimes obscure the chronic and sort of man-made nature of these things, right? These aren't acts of God. They are outcomes of deliberate policy choices that people have made over decades. And so that structural inequality that Black families face are a continuum of those systemic racism and economic policies that have just been entrenched for generations. And so again, often that language of crisis makes it feel like it's a moment in time or something that can be easily resolved or something that is temporary or unforeseeable. But just to emphasize that for marginalized families, for Black people and Black families, this anxiety and instability that the broader populace felt during the pandemic has long been a daily reality, right? And so this is a direct consequence of our history of policy decisions. It's a direct consequence of certain policy decisions being prioritized or certain communities being prioritized over others, right? And we have effectively weaved exclusion and instability into the very fabric of our institutions as a country. And so that's what creates this sort of structural racism that's deeply entrenched. And so let me just take a moment to have a drink. And so in my previous role, so I previously served as managing attorney at Community Legal Services of Philadelphia. I started off my career there right after law school. I was there as an intern, and then I did a lot of different things there at Community Legal Services. I actually started off doing work in the family advocacy unit, where I was representing parents who were caught up in the child welfare system, Department of Human Services in Philadelphia. And then I moved on and was doing an obscure area of law called childcare law, where I was representing childcare providers who were getting low-income childcare providers and nonprofits who were getting their businesses up and started or trying to maintain their businesses. And so did a lot of work around zoning. And then I moved on to do mortgage foreclosure defense, and then did landlord tenant law. And so I've done a lot of different things at Community Legal Services prior to moving on to PolicyLink. But most of my time was spent in our landlord tenant unit, where I served as managing attorney. And there, in that capacity, I directed several housing policy advocacy initiatives, provided legal representation to tenants, was fortunate to work at a place that both emphasized direct representation of tenants facing eviction and housing displacement, but also engaging in policy work, systems change work, working as part of a larger team of attorneys, paralegals, tenant organizers to preserve affordable housing for low-income Philadelphians and protect our housing. And as a housing attorney, I will just say that time governed every aspect of my work. And I'm talking about this because I'm also an artist. So the other part, Bob mentioned this early on, is that I'm an artist as well. And so in my art practice, I'm part of a collective called Black Quantum Futurism. And so part of what we look at is this idea of time and the way in which time is embedded in everything. It's embedded in all of our structures. It's embedded in all of our systems. And so as a housing attorney, right, I began to notice, especially one who thinks about and tries to bring my artistic practices into how I'm thinking about my work, especially Afrofuturism. But as a housing attorney, right, time governed every aspect of my work, from the mundane things, right, having to document my hours working on cases, what we call billable hours in some cases, but in the legal services world, you're not billing, right, but you do still have to document your hours, to all of the urgent and immediate things, right? Defending tenants in eviction court on the shortest timelines, right? Compared to when I was doing foreclosure work, the longer timelines that people had to resolve their cases, right? And that basic inequity, even there, if you're a tenant, you can lose your home in as few as 21 days after a court hearing. But if you are a homeowner, you can drag that process out of foreclosure to 2-3 years, right? I've filed bankruptcies and have carried that process out, extended that process years into the future, right? So just that basic inequity of time. And then to even the longer term and big picture. So when we're talking about things like preserving and accessing fair, safe, and affordable housing, all of those things are very time-based, very temporal. And so again, when we think about this issue of time, it's particularly poignant when we consider its impact on marginalized communities, and particularly those who are predominantly Black and low income. And so in such communities, time poverty is pervasive. Unlike more privileged communities, right, who have the luxury of being able to plan for their futures, These people are often caught in these relentless cycles to make it through each day and contending with the looming threat of eviction and other forms of systemic temporal oppression, right? Time oppression. And so this uneven distribution of time, it really exacerbates intergenerational poverty, contrasting sharply with the sort of wealth accumulation that we often see in traditionally privileged families. And so just like, right, in our society, we think of time as money, time is money, right? Time is a resource, and it is a resource that is often lacking in Black and low income communities. And I can say for me, right, again, I told you about my background, where I come from, right? Having a job, having a full-time job where I have a salary, right? That makes all the difference in terms of privilege and in terms of how I am able to manage and use my time versus someone who is low income, someone who has to work, 48 hours or 60 hours a week just to make a livable wage that's going to be able to pay for their monthly rent and all of their household expenses and other things, right? So again, this issue of time is ultimately interconnected with all of these different systems. And as a legal services attorney representing people who couldn't afford to pay for attorneys, right, the same economic inequities that my clients face presented themselves as temporal in nature, because again, time is money in our society. So when we think about things like eviction proceedings, time is of the essence. Temporal inequalities show up at every step of that process and all of its legal intricacies. So when we're thinking about the notice period, right? Some states give the most minimal notice period. We're lucky in Pennsylvania, we have at least 15 or 10-day notice period, depending on the type of lease that you have, in some cases 30 days. In other places, it may be 5 days, it may be 3 days, right? So this notion of how much notice you get for an eviction proceeding, time is of the essence there. And so thinking about that, thinking about the time it takes for a family who's been evicted to find new housing, especially if they have that fresh eviction record, the system is really rife with these temporal pitfalls, these time-based pitfalls that disproportionately impact marginalized communities. And so to give you another example, right, in practice, take Philadelphia. Over 34% of tenants who faced eviction between 2010 and 2020, so over a 10-year span, had a default judgment entered against them. And so that means that all the people who ended up in court, right, who had a court complaint filed against them for eviction, over 34% of those tenants got an automatic judgment against them because they failed to appear in court right on time. And so just thinking about, right, if you are a person facing eviction and you have court, right, and your court starts at a certain time, you may have all of these conflicting demands on your time. You may have to care for children. You may have to drop your kids off to work. You may have to attend work yourself. You may have to contend with unreliable public transportation. If you're a disabled person, you may have to take a certain type of transportation to get to the court. In Philadelphia in particular, there's only one eviction court, even though the city is huge. There's one eviction court. It's based downtown. And so ultimately, no one who is being evicted, few people, I won't say no one, but few people who are being evicted live in Center City because they can't afford to live there. And so ultimately, you may be coming from North Philadelphia, West Philadelphia, wherever it may be, where it takes you extra time to get downtown, right? And then something like a bus strike. So a couple summers ago, this actually happens pretty often. The bus system, SEPTA, went on strike. Did court delay its time that it opened? No, it did not. So for people who had to rely on public transportation, they were getting default judgments because they weren't making it to court on time. So think about that, right? These conflicting demands on time. The court is not forgiving, right? The law allows for eviction in as little as 21 days if you are not in court at 9 a.m. sharp. So I lied to you not, right? The court technically starts at 8:45. That's technically when the hearings start, but they give you a 15-minute grace period. If you show up in that courtroom at 9:01, right, and say your name starts with an A and you were called first, you could come in a minute later. You're being evicted 21 days after that, right? Because that is what the process says. That is what the timelines enable, right? And so that's the kind of conflicts that we see on people's time. And then it gets worse, right? So often tenants have not been served with notice of the court case. They won't receive notice if they've already moved out of the property. In Pennsylvania and in Philadelphia in particular, the notice requirements so if you are a landlord who's going to serve a complaint, for eviction onto a tenant, you don't have to hand that tenant the complaint. And this is this is amazing to think about, because for everything else, right, where you're not losing your home, if you're going to small claims court, if someone's suing you for a security deposit or whatever it may be, you get personal service. You get that complaint has to be handed to you in hand, right? And you have to sign something. Not for landlord tenant, right? They can post a complaint on a door. They can slip it through a mailbox. They can hand it to anybody. So anything could happen with that complaint. And that, you know, it could be a rainy day, it gets soaked, it gets blown away by a strong gust of wind. Anything could happen when you have a system when you're allowed to post on the door a complaint to be removed from, you know, to be removed from your home, basically. And so that, and then, right, we have a situation where people may not be getting notice under that circumstances or their court complaint. And then in Pennsylvania, I don't know what the situation is for Washington, but in Pennsylvania, the Landlord Tenant Act allows for a waiver of notice. And so that means in your lease agreement. And so that means for a person who has signed a lease agreement saying, you don't get notice if we want to evict you. We don't have to give you notice. These provisions are stripping tenants of even just that basic right to be informed that they may be homeless in a few months. And so this lack of notice reduces that already limited time for tenants to be able to respond. It reduces the time to be able to obtain legal advice or to try to find legal services. It reduces the time to prepare their defense, right? So it further tips the scale against people just by that basic structural rule that's been in place in the Landlord Tenant Act since the 70s or whenever it was written, right? And so these things further tip the scales of justice against people. And so again, this results in inadequate defenses. It results in complete court absence. And then for things like a clause in your lease agreement that waives your future notice, right? Tenants are often lacking the bargaining power from the get-go to be able to remove such provisions from their leases before signing it, right? So if you're a low-income tenant, you're a tenant with a voucher, right? You're not going to argue against that. If you see that in a lease agreement, even if you understand what it means, you're not going to argue against it. And if you do, you're probably not going to lose that apartment, right? So for tenants who have few options for housing, they can't afford to reject these rental offers. They can't afford to, you know, argue about what's in the lease agreement, even when that lease contains provisions that are unfair, illegal, or just ultimately against their best interests. And so, right, we know that when people are evicted and subsequently displaced from their neighborhoods, they are not moving into better situations, right? They're not moving into upward mobility in these situations. They are more likely to move into neighborhoods that have even less opportunities, worse outcomes overall, and when their life expectancies are literally cut shorter as a result of their housing conditions. So again, talk about time. In St. Louis, for example, your zip code is one of the strongest determinants of your health and life expectancy, as it is many other places. So children born in neighboring zip codes may face up to a 15-year difference in life expectancy. In Philadelphia, 20-year life expectancy difference for people living in a zip code where people face the highest rates of eviction. In Chicago, 16 years. New York, 9 years, right? So children living in high poverty areas of the city face more housing precarity, have their futures cut short, and are threatened by things that they cannot control. You know, where they lay their heads, where they eat, where they play. So again, this is a direct product of the housing policies that have been steeped in systemic racism and inequality for many generations. This is not new. This is not the result of a crisis in time or a moment in time, right? This is a long trajectory that we're seeing. And so again, I said this earlier, but evictions are not just a snapshot in time. Their consequences will extend far beyond temporary displacements, far beyond loss of shelter. You know, those judgments that are based on eviction, again, lead to loss of housing benefits. Housing vouchers, right? I'm probably speaking to the choir here, but right, when I represented someone who had a housing voucher who was facing eviction, their housing voucher was getting cut off, right? So not only are they being evicted from the place where they live, but the housing voucher, the thing that enables them to be able to rent at a price that's affordable for them, is being taken away from them. They are kicked out of that program as a result of being evicted, right? And so these things, they don't just impact that moment in time. They compromise the ability to be housed into the long term, in some cases for the rest of one's life. And so leading to these really dangerous cycles of poverty and instability. And then eviction, right, forces families to abandon their daily routines of home life. The times that, in Philadelphia, and you all may see this in your area too, we were seeing a wave of mass evictions happening in the city. And so those evictions, for people who aren't expecting them, right? You're on time with your rent, all these things you're doing good, you're perfect as a tenant. You are all of a sudden forced into a situation that upsets and disrupts your entire living, right? And so it causes people to lose their jobs, to have to move away, all of those sorts of things that can be a severe disruption to income, to mental health, to all of those things. And so eviction, it causes homelessness. It causes precarious housing arrangements. They are not just a moment in time that people can recover from. And some people do, obviously, right? But for many people, they are not able to recover. It puts them back into the throes of trauma, into abuse, into, again, behavioral health problems that cut across generations. They are not just limited to that person. And again, things that you already know: eviction forces survivors of domestic violence to return to their abusers. I have seen it time and time again, right? That and people who are living with abusers who get evicted as a result of that. Causing children to fall behind in school. If they're forced to change schools mid-year, they don't have a stable place to sleep. Causes people with mental illness, again, and it increases the risk of suicide. This is all research that you all can find. Would be happy to share additional resources around that. But just to say that evictions are not isolated. Housing is not an isolated social factor, right? It impacts every single thing. And then, right, even beyond the damage to people and families, it damages neighborhoods. Right, it forces and displaces and unravels the fabric of communities. It helps to ensure that neighbors remain strangers, right, in communities, and that their collective capacity to promote civil engagement remains untapped. And especially when you have, when you're in circumstances where tenants are put against homeowners, and this issue of tenure, right, becomes a part of who gets to have a say in a community. And often tenants are put at a place where they don't get to have a say, right, because they're all often on the edge of being evicted. But then they're seen and stereotyped as people who are transient and who don't have anything to give to their community. So it really frays the fabric of that civic engagement that people can do. And then again, I keep saying this, right? I'm obsessed with time, but just to say that eviction and housing stability is just not simply a crisis of the moment. It's sustained, it's a systemic failing. It has plagued marginalized communities forever, right? And this is not an unforeseen calamity, but the end result of deliberate policy choices that we have the power in a lot of circumstances to shift, to change, to think of differently. And then again, for those who are living, right, we had this quarantine or pandemic time. For many people, it's a never-ending crisis. It's a never-ending sense of pandemic time. It's a harsh daily reality for many people. And so that's why, right, programs like legal services, organizers, housing providers, advocates around the country have recognized that there are certain tools that can help us to get at some of these crises, right? And that they're not all perfect. They're not all perfect policy tools. They don't all work. And part of the issue, right, is that we tend to silo solutions as their own thing instead of figuring out the ways that they can work interconnectedly. So I want to just talk about a few things that have been helpful in Philadelphia in terms of how we started to think about addressing evictions issues and bringing race equity to bear upon how we address those things. So one of those ways is right to counsel. So as you all may know or may have heard of, right to counsel for evictions, right? It's an essential tool. It's one that recognizes that housing is one of the most important stabilizing factors, right? It's a gateway to stable employment, education, all the other opportunities that I already talked about. Right to counsel also, right, is not just about giving people and attorneys or increasing the number of attorneys in court, right? Right to counsel programs also help to ensure fairness in the court process. And again, that tenants who are dealing with health and life-threatening conditions have a pathway to repair. So, it can often get this bad name that, like, if you're involving lawyers, it's about, trying to get more time and doing all these other things. But lawyers also help to lead people on pathways to repair as well. And if a tenant can't stay in their home, right, legal representation can ensure that tenants have the time, right, that time notion again, right? As a lawyer, my job is, if I'm walking into the courtroom, it's not just about can I keep the tenant here? It's about what's the best circumstances for that person? What's the thing that they want? What's their ultimate goals as well, right? And so for the situations where they can't stay in their home because it's not healthy, because there's been a relationship breakdown such that they can no longer live there with that, with that landlord, my job is then to ensure that they have the time to be able to locate suitable housing, to be able to move on without an eviction record that's going to follow them for the rest of their lives, or at least try to make that record look better, so that they can find future housing. And so you often need a lawyer who's experienced in landlord-tenant law to understand how to navigate the court process, and that's no matter what your level of education is, right? Tenants know this, and they often won't have a fair hearing in court if they go alone. And also many have firsthand experience with the court process already and want to avoid re-experiencing that trauma. And it may also be the case that people don't have access to a fax machine, don't have access to a post office to get stamps and respond to something, aren't able to take off work, might have mobility issues, all those things that prevent timely responding to court process. And so when we see that tenants have the time and support to respond to an eviction notice, have legal representation, have access to housing counseling, have access to rental assistance, all those things which legal services can help facilitate in some circumstances, it can change the outcomes. It can make all the difference between a family staying housed or becoming homeless with lifelong negative impacts. And so we've seen that with legal aid programs that have already providing legal representation, right, that alone is not enough. And so we see that these right to counsel programs, when implemented correctly, there's a dramatic increase in representation. There's almost 50 percentage points in some cases where representation has risen. And we know that it's cost effective as well. So I'm gonna skip around a little bit just for purposes of time, right? But just to say that, right, in Philadelphia, we held a campaign that spanned about 7 years to create a right to counsel, and it successfully ended in right to counsel legislation, which passed in 2019 and then implemented a few years later once we figured out some of the funding issues. And so the two initial zip codes that were selected due to the high number and rate of evictions and proportion of families in poverty and zip codes were the two places where right to counsel was implemented. And we've already seen impacts specifically in terms of race, who's being represented, and gender. And that eviction representation has risen by more than 10%. And so again, addressing the complex issues of housing inequality and the eviction crisis necessitates a multi-pronged approach, right? So I named one solution, right? But again, we need things that's going to incorporate immediate relief, systemic changes, as well as an explicit commitment to race equity. And so in Philadelphia, our strategies have been sort of manifold and interconnected. We prioritize 3 specific interventions. So one I talked about already, providing tenants with the right to legal counsel in eviction cases, implementing a pre-eviction filing diversion program, and regulating eviction records to protect tenants' future housing opportunities. And so in addressing sort of the immediacy of the so-called eviction crisis, particularly in the ways in which it was deepened by the COVID-19 pandemic, we really looked at an eviction diversion program as a catalyst, as well as the rental assistance program as a catalyst, right? These things accelerated our efforts to divert eviction cases, again, things that are stemming from financial difficulties, interpersonal conflicts, those sorts of things, away from courtrooms and into a mediation process. And so that's what the pre-filing eviction diversion program was, working with city council, working with the courts to ensure that any landlord who is filing an eviction complaint in the courts gets that complaint rejected unless they have gone through an eviction diversion program. And that's only for certain kinds of cases. So in cases where there's, perhaps a breach of a condition of the lease agreement, that one may not be eligible for that kind of a process. But for the most part, most cases can go through that process. And again, that avoids a court record, that avoids someone getting an eviction record that's going to follow them for the rest of their lives. And then also, right, again, that eviction filing diversion program helps to draw down the rental assistance funds. And so you have a mechanism that helps to access funds quicker, especially in cases where it is about rent payments, it is about relationship breakdown. You have housing counselors, you have mediators embedded in that, and you have that interconnected then with the right to counsel, right? Because we have to recognize that not all cases can be diverted from court. So for more intricate cases that involve violations of tenant rights, habitability issues, reasonable accommodations, things where we want people to have an attorney, right? Things where we want people to be able to exercise and access their rights. You connect that eviction diversion program right to that right to counsel program. So at the point that the eviction diversion program isn't working, there's been a breakdown there, it's not about money, it can't be resolved there, you automatically are in a pipeline to have access to an attorney that's going to help you in court, right? So again, not seeing these two things as divided solutions, but finding ways to very explicitly connect rental assistance to right to counsel, to avoiding eviction records, to non-court remedies like housing counselors and other things, right? Guarantees, a place where we can start to attack and intervene in different parts of the system. And then again, while these interventions offer immediate relief, they alone won't rectify the longstanding systemic inequities that we face in these systems, right? And so eviction records, again, serve as these lifetime sentences for tenants, severely limiting their housing options, even with legal representation. And so they get caught up in these cycles. And so, as you all may know, right, landlords often rely on tenant screening tools to derive a tenant's rental history. So they're looking at tenant screening reports. They may be refusing to rent to prospective tenants because of the existence of an eviction filing. And then often these tenant screening reports are providing a score that is based on opaque information. So for example, I've had clients who, again, maybe never showed up in court because they resolved the situation before it ended up in court, but the landlord or the property manager filed an eviction filing, for whatever reason. That will show up on a tenant screening report and will drop their score by like 40% with no understanding of how things are weighted, right? And so these are the sorts of things that can often get people caught up again in these barriers where people are refusing to rent to them. And it turns into a fair housing issue because again, right, we often know that the people who have eviction records most often are Black women. And so when these women are going out to rent, right, they are often met with these sorts of policies that deny them automatically on the basis of an eviction record. And so in Philadelphia, we sought to try to deal with those issues. Particularly, we sought to try to deal with how accessible the eviction record was, and sought to deal with it through the lens of fair housing. Again, understanding the fair housing impacts and that discrimination may be happening in these situations unintentionally, right? Just off the mere fact that that the people most likely to have eviction records are Black women, just like in the realm of criminal records, right? And so in Philadelphia, we created a law called the Renters Access Act. It's a local law that creates a tenant screening policy that provides guidelines for prospective landlords on how eviction records can be used when landlords review tenant applications. So under this act, before accepting a tenant's application to rent a unit, landlords and property managers have to provide prospective tenants with uniform screening criteria that specify what they will be using to evaluate their applications. Right, so that cuts down or reduces situations where landlords are giving different screening criteria, setting up different circumstances for admission than they are for other people. It prevents policy making where landlords have a policy where if you have 3 kids, they're going to exclude you, or you have a voucher, those sorts of things, right? And so it gives tenants also the opportunity to know what they're going to be evaluated against, so that they're not wasting time and money if they know that this landlord's not going to accept people with XYZ. The other thing that this law does, it does several other things. I'm not going to go into all of them, but the other piece that connects very deeply to the fair housing piece is that it bans blanket bans. And so basically it's a ban the box for eviction records. It says that landlords cannot have blanket policies where they are excluding people on the basis of having an eviction record, one or more eviction records, and on the basis of their credit score alone. And so it builds a policy where landlords have to have a holistic screening criteria, have to consider all of the pieces of the application, cannot just have a policy from the start that says you can't get in because of your credit score or your eviction records. And then the last thing I'll say about this policy is that it provides tenants with any third-party records that the landlord has used to screen their application, so that tenants get an opportunity to see what it is that the landlord is using or what has used, right? and again, gives them future information as they're looking for other properties. And then it also gives the tenant an ability to come back to that prospective landlord and say, hey, this was wrong. This record was wrong. My circumstances have changed since then. So it really just opens up that time barrier, right, that we often see where the eviction record is talking about something that happened in the past, and that past event is dictating your future forever, right? But with this law, you can now add information into the past. You can make the past a little bit more expansive, and you can change the relationship of that past record to the future, right? You can have a more open future with more ability to find a decent place to live. And so, right, in all of these campaigns, we made a deliberate and explicit commitment to race equity. And that's the important part, right? And this is a challenge because particularly in the realm of legal services, the issue of eviction has long been framed as more a matter of poverty than anything. We lack comprehensive data on eviction records, right? We know all the income information, but when it came to racial and gender dimensions, it was really difficult for us to understand what that looked like beyond our sort of anecdotes or even like the legal services data, right? Like, so I knew all of my clients, over 70% of the clients that I saw at legal services were Black women. And you can assume that that's the people who are being filed against in court, but we lack that comprehensive data. However, we rose to this challenge. We made concerted efforts to include data, to work with research partners that could get us that information, and to also include narratives and personal stories that broke free from sort of the confines of the intake waiting room and the courtroom. So we went out into the communities, we met people where they were, we explicitly highlighted stories of race, disability, age, other intersecting marginalized identities when it came to talking about the problem. And then we involved those people, right? We didn't just talk about them, we talked with them, we included them, right? When we had when the mayor created a mayor's eviction prevention task force, we fought hard to ensure that tenants were a part of that task force, working with the tenant unions to ensure that they're at the table as these laws are being developed. When they are trying to push a law, making sure that we show up for them and that we support them as well, right? So that has to be taken seriously at every stage of the process. Race equity has to be taken seriously at every stage of the process. It goes beyond mere representation of people of color, right? It's not just representation. It's not just, we're serving people of color, therefore we are doing race equity. That's not it, unfortunately. In Philadelphia, again, one of the ways that we took that serious is that making sure that our programs had race equity outcomes, right? That if we were going to implement a right to counsel, that right to counsel need to be representing the people who are most impacted, the demographics that are most impacted. So ensuring that we implement it in a way that would actually get at the gender and racial inequities that were embedded in the system. And then other approaches, right? We hired staff, we embedded sort of race equity and equity into the intake processes. We looked at every part of it, right? So just to say that equity in and of itself is not flat. It's not just equity and then you say equity and you're doing equity. It doesn't work like that, right? There's multiple dimensions to it. There's procedural equity, there's structural equity, there's equity in process, there's equity in transparency, so all of these ways, just trying to embed, looking at the different layers. And then also part of it is representation, right? So enabling more lawyers of color, more people who look like me to connect with people, to be in court, to understand the various aspects of the system and how they work, I think is also extremely, extremely important. So bringing that representation into the professional services that we are providing people as well. I have a few more things, but I know that I'm drawing close to time. I think the last thing that I'll highlight is that, for all of this, I threw out some statistics, but I try not to be too statistic heavy, right? Because we have to recognize that behind all of these statistics, behind every policy debate, there are real people. There are real families who are facing fear and uncertainty of losing their homes, and not just losing their homes, what happens after that, the aftermath of that, and how it's going to impact the rest of their lives, how it's going to impact the next generation of their families, right? And so by prioritizing their experiences, their concerns, their voices, we build policies that are truly representative and responsive to the needs of the people who are most impacted. And again, centering those affected people allows us to understand the true impact of evictions and what we need to do to fix it. Working with organizers, working with tenants, working with people directly impacted through movement lawyering and community lawyering tools changed my whole life. It changed my whole career. It changed my whole approach. And so I just can't emphasize enough that building those relationships with people most impacted and with community leaders, it's the most important thing. I often share the story of a dear friend and organizer in Philadelphia, Miss Karen Harvey. She's in her 70s. I share her story because she's extremely vocal about it herself, and she's often writing op-eds about just various housing issues. But Miss Karen was a tenant at a building in West Philly where she had lived for decades, in a neighborhood close to the University of Pennsylvania and other gentrifying neighborhoods in the city that housed a tight-knit community of nearly 200 people. And then one day, a New York investor bought the building in November of 2017, promising there would be no changes in rent, no changes in services. But by March, had issued 30 and 60-day notices to every tenant in that building to vacate, just a few short months later. They illegally broke the leases of people who had terms for another year or more. They filed evictions in court. They gave people with Section 8 vouchers less time to move while giving private renters additional time to move and a moving bonus. And then they started cutting the heat and electricity off in the building before the time was up, locking people out, locking the entrance gates to the properties. And so working closely with a emerging tenants union in Philadelphia, we were able to use a lot of hybrid strategies and forums, eviction court, organizing, blockades, discrimination complaints, that were based on age, race, and disability discrimination. And we were able to help many of the tenants transition and get more time in their units or get more settlement or get some settlement funds for discrimination cases. But the most powerful thing, in my opinion, to emerge from the mass eviction was Miss Karen. The radicalization of Miss Karen and the other tenants in the building who would go on to join, become leaders in the tenant union. And now at 70-something years old, Miss Karen is the campaign leader of the first rent control coalition to emerge in Philadelphia in decades. And she's fighting for rent control. And so it's not an exaggeration to say, right, when we center the people most impacted by these things, the work is more sustainable, the work is more effective, the policies and the solutions are more effective. And for me, to end it, right, it's not an exaggeration to say that I became the type of attorney that I needed when I was younger, and that legal services and these social services programs made it possible for the ability for people with lived experiences to go on to have healthy, happy, stable lives that enable them to become leaders in their own communities and fight for fairness and justice for everyone. And so this way, representation matters, presence matters, right? And what you feed and pour into the people who are most impacted matters. And when we have places where we can validate, where people can have their experiences validated and recognized, and the unique challenges that they encounter recognized, right? Everyone's all the better for it. So I will end there. I had like a lot more to talk about, but I'll end there because I see I'm at time, and I'll turn it back to Bob for any questions.
Thank you, Rasheedah. That was a powerful presentation. As you know, we've indicated you can put questions in the chat. So please put those questions there that we can continue on. And in waiting for the first question to come through, my question to you, Rasheedah, is you did a lot of work in Philly. Where else in the country have you heard great tenants' rights being input into the system?
Yeah, that's a great question. So in my former capacity at Legal Services, my work was primarily focused in Philadelphia and Pennsylvania. But now in my capacity at PolicyLink, I am privileged to work nationally with places all over the country that are doing really brilliant tenant work. And so I can name lots of different places, and we're tracking policies, and I can share some in the chat. But California, for example, is just doing amazing work, both at the state level, right? They're advancing things like social housing. They've advanced forms of rent control at the state level. They've advanced a record sealing policy at the state level, and then even locally, right? They're within their counties, within their cities, advancing things like criminal records policies that will help, ban the box for people who are trying to access housing with criminal records. And then also we've seen the federal government really pay a lot of attention now to tenants' rights and issues, right? So of course, during the pandemic, we saw historic investments from the federal government in terms of rental assistance and other protections, eviction moratorium. But even after that, the Biden administration has made a commitment to advancing tenant rights. And so earlier this year, put out a blueprint for a tenant bill of rights that talks about what all of the federal agencies, sort of an all hands approach from the federal agencies in supporting tenant rights and protections, and naming many of the critical policies that I talked about. And so right to counsel, eviction diversion, rental assistance, these sorts of things that the federal government is uplifting and figuring out ways to support and fund people in localities to be able to advance these critical policies. So we've also seen, for example, HUD make a historic investment in right to counsel and tenant legal representation by giving millions of dollars to services to advance right to counsel.
Okay, I'm still waiting on questions. You're getting lots of great accolades for your presentation. Another question I have for you while I'm waiting is the effect of the child care tax credit. You mentioned mothers and single mothers, and that child care tax credit, was that the major influence in helping many low-income women come out of poverty?
I can't speak to that too knowledgeably because I myself have not worked on child tax credit in my professional capacity, but I can say from my personal experience, yes, that it has been, especially as a person who was a young mother and again, young single parent, that it was extremely helpful in supporting me when I was eligible for it. Yes.
Okay, great. Reach out to our tech people. Do we have any questions for Rasheedah? I can tell you a couple of comments, Rasheedah, from Amber Rowe Mosley. She writes, "Thank you so much. That was wonderfully informational." And from an Angel, "Thank you for such an amazing presentation and providing this information. This is information that needs to be heard loud and clear throughout the nation." And then also from Tierra Bonds, "So powerful. Thank you, Rasheedah." And Kay, here's a question from Adrian Hauser. He writes, "What next steps would you like to see in Washington?" I'm assuming Washington State or maybe Washington, D.C. Pick one.
Got it. I'll pick both. So Washington State, we are working with some partners in Washington that I know are thinking about things like rent stabilization and thinking about other tenant protections that can be advanced at the state level. And so part of the work that we've done with some of our partners in Washington is thinking about narrative strategy and how narrative strategy, so being able to tell the stories, right? Being able to communicate the deeply held values of a lot of these policies that we're trying to advance. And so that's part of the work that we've been doing in Washington. And so what I would like to say that I would like to see is just whatever the organizers and the people most impacted want to come out of Washington, right? That's what we want to see and what we want to support. And then as far as Washington, D.C., got a lot. I would love to talk. Part of what we're waiting on is the new affirmatively furthering fair housing rule to be finalized. And so I'm sure you all are familiar with that. And that would be another hope that I would have for Washington in terms of like the state, in terms of fair housing laws and thinking about how you all are thinking about AFFH once it comes out and how you all position that, especially as a housing finance agency, thinking about affirmatively furthering fair housing. So would love to see more conversations about that. And if there's ways that PolicyLink can support some of those conversations as they unfold with the finalized rule next year, I would love to be in touch with folks. But in terms of Washington, D.C., I am very hopeful about all of the things that, again, they've been advancing. It's in the right place. And I think the all-hands government approach, really involving agencies like HUD and Consumer Finance Protection Bureau and FTC in the charge of thinking about things like eviction records, thinking about things like rent control for FHFA-backed properties. It's really promising, and I think it's really, in some ways, historic level of engagement around tenant rights and protections that we're seeing coming from the federal government.
And we have another question from Angel. "Are you seeing that greater access to homebuyer education is making any impact for traditionally marginalized communities?"
I would say that it is. I think education is like very key, but I think there's a lot of barriers, right, that are new, not new barriers, obviously, but things that are coming into our awareness about the challenges of people being able to become homeowners and being able to access home buying opportunities. So things like appraisal bias or things like property taxes, or just things that make the barrier of access and the barrier of maintaining these things really challenging for low income and marginalized families. But I think there's promising things happening. So I was fortunate to be on the board of the Pennsylvania Housing Finance Agency for about a year or two. And so just some of the things that I've seen PHFA do and think about in terms of LIHTC properties, some of its policies around that, and then some of the policies and programs that it's built up to make home ownership accessible for people like me. I have even benefited prior to becoming a part of the board. I was able to buy my first home because of first home owner buyer resources from Pennsylvania Housing Finance Agency. So again, speaking from personal experience, absolutely yes, education in addition to resources that make it possible for people to, especially for communities that don't have a, rich grandmom or rich aunt or uncle who they can get a down payment assistance from. I know that was the case for me. And so I needed a low interest loan of $3,000 just to, do closing costs, all those sorts of things. Those programs are really important in addition to education, the things that make it possible for people to access, and then the things that make it possible for people to maintain their homes so they're not being foreclosed upon in a few years and they can keep these properties within their communities.
Well, Rasheedah, we've come to the end of our time. We want to thank you for your presentation. In the chat, you will see if you want to give us feedback on this session to write at info@housinglaw.org. Also, for information, this session has been recorded. And with that, we want to thank you again for being here for the first session. Our next session will be next Thursday, September 21st. First is with The Future is Electricity, and our keynoter will be Dr. Leah Stokes. And looking forward to see you at that time. Thank you all and have a great evening. Bye-bye.